Latecomers, we'd like to start. All right, so welcome to the last plenary of this weekend. All's well that ends well, so there's no better way of ending this conference than by having Daniel Xerri giving the closing plenary. Daniel is a lecturer in TESOL at the University of Malta. He's the author of many publications in the areas of education and TESOL, and some of his work is published in, for example, The Image in English Language Teaching, published by the British Council, the ELT Council, which I recommend. I've got it. And it's a very interesting and useful book. So he wants to make it short, so I won't take much more time. We all know who Daniel is, and you will have an opportunity to enjoy this plenary. It's going to be really interesting. Daniel, please. Salamanca. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Gerard, and the rest of the committee of TESOL-SPAIN. I'm very happy to be here and to be talking at this conference. The first time I attended this conference was actually 8 years ago in Bilbao. And I realized what an excellent conference it was, and I've always been looking forward to actually attend again, but I've never found the opportunity to do so. So I'm very happy that I was invited to be here with you and to talk about what I consider to be an important topic, the multicultural classroom. As you can see on the slide, I've chosen a bit of a strange image to accompany what I consider to be a very beautiful phenomenon, the idea that we live in a multicultural society and that we actually teach multicultural classrooms, or at least those of us who are lucky enough to do so. Perhaps could you take a few seconds to think about what this image has to do with multiculturalism? And tell your partner. Okay, so we're a big group, so I won't be able to hear what you have to say about this. But it is very much related to something that I'm interested in as someone who researches people's beliefs, values, attitudes, and practices. For me, multiculturalism, as I've said, is something very positive. But most often, we encounter people for whom, as a phenomenon, it is something negative, something to be shunned, to be avoided. And those perceptions, those attitudes towards multiculturalism most often stem from people's beliefs about what the classroom should look like, about what society should look like, and about what the world should look like. And these beliefs that they have about the world, about the classroom, about their students, influence what they do if they are teachers. So I hail from a very tiny country, a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, a population of less than 500,000 people, and you can actually cross the entire island in 1 hour if there isn't enough traffic. And for many, many years, Malta wasn't considered to be a multicultural society. And people always considered themselves to be Maltese, and then we have foreigners who come to Malta to visit as tourists, and that's it. If you're a teacher of English, you're used to teaching Maltese students in your primary and secondary school, and the students you teach are people who are largely Maltese. But then, a few years ago, I started hearing from colleagues teaching in the primary school sector that things were changing. There was this new phenomenon where they were having more and more students from different parts of the world. And I became interested to know more about this, and especially about the teachers' experiences of this particular phenomenon. So what I did is I contacted a former classmate of mine who taught at the school that was considered to be at the forefront of what was happening in education when it comes to multiculturalism. And I asked him to help me organize a little study whereby I would interview the teachers about their experiences. And so I wanted to know more about what the teachers felt about teaching English and other subjects, because remember, these are primary school teachers, in such a context. What they perceived to be the benefits and the challenges of doing so. My main interest, I must say, was primarily in their experience of English within that particular context. I should have perhaps focused more intently on the multicultural experience. And these teachers started pointing out that suddenly, in this school of 800 students, they were having students from 35 different nationalities, different languages in the classroom, students whom they could no longer speak to in Malta's national language, Maltese, or else in its official language, English, and be understood. You had students who were native speakers of English, and other students for whom English was a completely new language. And all of these students were in the same classroom. And even though they did mention challenges, and I'll be talking about some of the challenges of actually teaching in such a context, they also mentioned that there were a number of benefits. And there were a number of benefits in terms of English language teaching. They realized that even the Maltese students, hailing from families who were Maltese-speaking, were suddenly developing a more positive attitude towards English. And this was not because they needed to pass an exam, they needed to do better at school. Suddenly, they needed English because that was the language that could enable them to actually communicate in the playground. So that positive attitude was immediately picked up by the teachers. And they described this new context in which they were teaching as an ideal learning context when it comes to learning the second language, English. The students were also registering better results when it comes to English, and there was suddenly improved fluency when it comes to English language speaking. The students' own attitude, as I've mentioned, was highly positive. And as we can see from this quote, when they compared the results of the students to those from schools, to those of students from schools that weren't so multicultural, there was a difference. They felt that there was a difference. It was the teachers' perceptions communicating with their colleagues at other schools, but they felt that their students were suddenly doing better, much better in English. And as I've mentioned, there were also challenges, and these were some of the challenges that the teachers identified. The first one, which I've already referred to, is the fact that they were faced with a mixed ability classroom, students of varying levels all coming together in one classroom, and the teachers sometimes having to resort to such techniques as translation of the textbooks, sometimes written in Maltese, into English in order for them to be able to communicate with all these different nationalities in the classroom. What they also saw was that there was a lack of support from the school itself and from home. And sometimes this was not the parents' fault, because some of these parents didn't have any English as well, or they didn't have the necessary proficiency to help their own children with the tasks that they were set for homework. Moreover, there was the issue of large classes, and another important issue which they felt was very, very important for them was the inadequate training that they had been provided with. So these teachers had gone through a teacher education course at university, but no one had told them about the context in which they will eventually be teaching in. No one had told them about what is needed to teach in a multicultural classroom. And they weren't given any form of support in terms of continuing professional development by the educational authorities. Here we have a quote by one of the teachers that I interviewed who talks about taking these students, some of them with no knowledge of English, and suddenly throwing them into deep end, but they managed not to drown. And they didn't drown because they were also receiving a lot of support from their own classmates. And what happened in this particular school, which was, I think, phenomenal, was the fact that the teachers weren't receiving support from the authorities, from the people who were responsible for training them and mentoring them, but then they helped one another. They helped one another with the resources, with the necessary support. When a new teacher was employed, they actually mentored them in order to be able to address the challenges of teaching in that particular context. The majority of them relied on their experience of teaching in that context in order for them to actually help address the needs of the students. And in this quote from another teacher, we see what I've already mentioned. Inadequately prepared for the context in which they were expected to actually teach. And the kind of training that they were receiving, because they were expected to do a certain number of hours of training every year, was completely removed or divorced from the reality of their own classroom. And that's why they felt supporting one another was the best solution. But all of them were highly positive about this idea of teaching in a multicultural context. And as I've said, I didn't focus on it in the study, but they did point out that the students, besides the linguistic benefits, they were also benefiting from acquiring things that we've already mentioned in this particular conference. Those global skills, those English for 21st century skills that we need in order to survive in this kind of context that we live in. So the students were open to the world. They weren't perhaps insular like they were before actually learning English in such a context. And some of the benefits of multicultural education are, in fact, that multicultural education provides you with access to those different perspectives. And this enables you to go against prejudice. And there can be a lot of prejudice in society, as I'll be highlighting later in this talk. It also allows you to become more tolerant of different ways of living one's life, of one's culture and other cultures. And most importantly, and I'll be addressing this towards the end, is the idea that multicultural education can enable us as educators to galvanize empathy. And empathy has already been mentioned by a number of speakers at this conference, is a very important outcome of education. And we should see it, perhaps, as something that we should be doing as educators. Rather than just language teachers, we are educators, as has already been mentioned. Now, the reason why Malta suddenly became multicultural was because of this one phenomenon. Now, before becoming a teacher educator at university, I spent 10 years teaching English in secondary schools and high schools. And in some of my lessons, I did attempt to actually address the issue of migration. And using multimodal resources, as I'll be showing later, I helped students to actually think about their own beliefs in relation to migration, their own attitudes, their own practices as citizens of a society that was rapidly changing because of such a phenomenon. And when I mentioned this word, when I mentioned this phenomenon, these were some of the images that the students immediately thought of, images that they had seen on the media, images that influenced them in the way they perceived the phenomenon. And most probably you're familiar with these images. Images which can be divisive and can lead to very different interpretations, especially when you look at a very small society like the one that I hail from. Here we have, for example, young migrants at the Greek and Turkish border. And for those of you who follow the news, you know what's currently happening and all the political ramifications of that particular event and how people are being used as pawns by the different governments. Even the name of a ship can resonate with us. And it can lead to very contrasting views. Some people see the NGOs, including Spanish NGOs, who save migrants from off the coast of North Africa as doing something amazing. Other people are dead set against it. So you have those polar opposites when it comes to people's attitudes towards this topic of migration. But it's important to actually discuss it, and it's important to actually enable our students to reflect on where they stand in relation to this phenomenon. And it's also important to enable them to think about why they might have certain attitudes and beliefs, because they weren't born with those attitudes and beliefs. They might have inherited them from their interactions with other people in their society, from the consumption of the media. And if we look at this phenomenon in terms of numbers, and we look at the most recently available statistics for it, those published last year for the previous year, we realize that there are millions of people who are experiencing the negative side of migration. And according to the UNHCR, nearly 1 person is forcibly displaced every 2 seconds. Think about that. Every 2 seconds that pass by, a person is uprooted from what they call their home. And since we're all educators and we come in touch with many young people and we try to empathize with them, we are working to help them fulfill their potential. We enable them to actually aspire and achieve their dreams. It is also highly disconcerting to realize that these figures represent people, and they represent millions of young people as well. In fact, looking at the stats, we realize that over 50% of all refugees are minors. These could be our students if we had to be born in a different context, if we had to be teaching in a completely different context. In fact, we've spoken about very important global issues at this conference. And one of them, perhaps, is the crisis of solidarity that we are experiencing. It is a crisis because we know that not everyone is willing to express solidarity. And as the former Secretary General of the UN says, it is a crisis of solidarity. There are people in our societies, perhaps in our schools, who are not willing to extend the same kind of solidarity that we might be willing to extend to people who are experiencing this particular phenomenon. Thinking about my own context, when it comes to migrants from North Africa, who are usually the most visible in terms of them being migrants because of how they arrive in the country, there have been many who have actually reached Malta. But another figure which the Maltese population sometimes ignores is the fact that very few of them stay in the country. And despite the fact that my own society is most often described as being tolerant and we welcome people from other countries, at the same time, we are also a country that perhaps in many ways avoids this issue or tries to avoid dealing with the needs of these people. In fact, you get to see things like this. Racism on the walls. And that quote at the bottom of the image is a quote from a play called Lampedusa by Anders Lustgarten. Some of you might have watched it being performed. And it talks about the experiences of migrants and the horrors that they face. But it also talks about the prejudice of the people who make them feel unwelcome. Make them feel unwelcome not because of economic issues only, but most often because they refuse to understand where these people are coming from. Coming from not in the literal sense, but in the metaphoric sense. There's a willful misunderstanding, as he says, when it comes to migration. And at the same time, in this particular context, which might resonate with other contexts that you're familiar with, we also have an economic boom. An economic boom that has resulted in massive development and increased wealth for the population. Now, as you know, when you have an economic boom and you have a very small population, you need to rely on the very phenomenon that you might feel negative towards. You rely on migration. So economic migrants over the past few years have increased exponentially. In this article from 2018, it mentions 43,000 foreign workers, but that figure has actually increased even further. And there are people coming to the island from all parts of the world looking for work. There's plenty of work, there's plenty of money to be made, but at the same time, the people who are benefiting from that all sometimes are also reluctant to appreciate the contribution made by migrants. And you even have negative sentiments like this one expressed by the opposition leader, the current opposition leader. And you have rhetoric being used that is prejudiced, negative, and in many cases, even racist. And sometimes people in the media forget that the rhetoric you use, when you use words like flooded, invaded, influx, all of those words lead to certain attitudes on behalf of who is consuming the products of the media. In fact, in a study conducted in 2013, they analyzed collocations with the word migrant and immigrant, and they realized that many words are actually negative. They have negative connotations. So when they examine the collocations of the words with migrant and migration, they realize that there is a lot of negativity being expressed in the media itself. So the discourse that our young people, my former students, were being exposed to was, in some cases, highly negative. And that very discourse helped to shape their beliefs, their attitudes, and their practices as young people and citizens of a society that was benefiting from migration. And when people actually engage in such negative beliefs and practices, what they sometimes fail to realize is that they might know migrants in their own family. They might know migrants in their own population. Here I'm going to show you a picture from 1948. This picture was taken in Sydney, at the harbour. And these people are migrants, and they also happen to be Maltese migrants. So what's ironic and perhaps a bit paradoxical here is that in certain societies, here in Europe and elsewhere, the very people who have benefited from migration sometimes express very negative sentiments in relation to migration. I've seen this in my own country. I see it even now with some of the sentiments expressed in relation to the coronavirus. And it worries me because we teach young people and we know that they are highly susceptible to the kind of language that we use when we talk about migrants. And I want to remind you of the benefits of multicultural education. The benefits are varied, but empathy is, for me, one of the most important ones. Because multicultural education can put us in touch with the very people that we might see as the other. Those people become our friends, they become our classmates, they become our colleagues. And then we realize that they are not some kind of stranger, some kind of number. They are actually people that we can relate to. So empathy, I feel, is one of the most important competences that we can develop as English language teachers, not just teaching structures and tenses, but perhaps helping our learners to develop something which makes them better human beings. And when we look at what empathy is capable of doing, it enables us to become better at appreciating the different perspectives and the different circumstances and the different experiences that people have. In fact, here, Quek describes it as moving students towards deeper levels of engagement and understanding, not of the language necessarily, but of human experiences. And this is very important because someone whom I admire very much said, we tend to speak quite a lot about the fiscal deficit. In a country like the one I come from, we're very worried sometimes about the economy and whether certain issues like this recent virus might affect the economy. So we talk about the dangers of a deficit. But in reality, what we should be worrying about as human beings, as teachers, is the empathy deficit in our society. And Sarah mentioned, and even other speakers mentioned, that we can do something about it. We can change the world. We can all be mosquitoes who can actually contribute to changing the world. And if we identify an empathy deficit in our society, in our context, we are at the forefront. We actually have a very influential role. We can help to develop the values, the beliefs, the attitudes, the practices of our learners. And we can help to address that empathy deficit. A writer who published a book on empathy talks about how people who are empathic, they are able to actually step into other people's shoes and to see the world through their eyes. So if we can use certain resources in our classroom to do that, that would be amazing. So the other part of my talk is about how multimodal resources, and we all use them, we currently use them. Multimodal resources enable us to do that. They can enable us to do that. And if we look at what multimodality is all about, it's nothing out of the ordinary. It's actually when you intelligently combine two different media together so that the output is far more important, far more significant, far more resonant than the output of those two media kept separate. Or as Kress and Van Leeuwen define it, the use of several semiotic modes in the design of a semiotic product or event, together with the particular way in which these modes are combined. A poem kept on the page is already multimodal as soon as you recite it. It becomes even more multimodal when you transform it into a video clip, when you add images and sound to it. So a text, in combination with other ways of actually looking at that text, leads us to something far more engaging. And for many, many decades, we've talked about the importance of motivation. And many of us in this room associate motivation with the work of Zoltán Dornier. But I was lucky enough a couple of years ago to be in Chicago and listen to Dornier talk about how now in his research, and even in the research of our colleague Sarah Mercer, we're moving towards the notion of engagement. And the reason for that is because even the most highly motivated student can ultimately be prone to be distracted. And so, motivation, as he puts it, is what prepares the deal, and engagement is indispensable for sealing the deal. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning engagement is because multimodal resources can be highly engaging. And as I've seen in some of the sessions at this conference and at other conferences, we do devote quite a lot of attention to them in our work as language teachers, because we realize that we can help to engage our learners with the language, the target language that we are enabling them to learn. But multimodal resources, as I've been arguing so far, can also be used to engage our learners with those global skills and competences that they need in order for them to actually perhaps become more humane human beings. People who can address the empathy deficit and do something about the solidarity crisis. Here we have an image. And could you perhaps turn to your partner and tell them what this image suggests to you? How would you interpret it? Any thoughts? Would anyone like to shout out what they think of this picture? How would you describe it? If you were describing it, what do you see? A piece of meat? Okay. And she's enjoying it, okay. Yes, definitely. Yeah, so she appears very glamorous. It's Rihanna in the mouth of a shark. This photo was created for Harper's Bazaar. So here glamour is what comes to mind, but at the same time the dangers of the shark and being in the mouth of a shark, but also other implications of that. What do we think of placing a woman inside the mouth of a shark? Now, the same kind of image was also used by someone whose work I came across many years ago when I was actually teaching in high school, and whose work I used in order to actually address the very thing that I'm trying to talk about today, the need to develop our students' empathy. And this person, her name is Xerri, is a poet. She's a Somali British poet. And she wrote a number of poems about the issue of migration. And one of them was inspired by her experience of meeting migrants at the abandoned Somali embassy in Rome, talking to them, interviewing them, and realizing what leaving one's home actually means, and how frightening, how horrible, how tragic, how traumatic that experience actually is. So the image here has a very different meaning from the image in this line. And this particular line from her poem Home is trying to really make us think about those reasons for which people leave their home. We talked about how many millions of people have been displaced, forcibly displaced from their homes. How many young people end up going to Europe, sometimes without an adult accompanying them. And we've also mentioned that we, as the privileged people, we sometimes willfully misunderstand why all of this happens. And in her work, in this particular poem, but also in other poems as well, what she tries to do is to remind us and to make us listen to the voices of the people that we don't get to hear on the news. And this was one of the things that worried me as a teacher in high school. The fact that my students were being exposed to the language used on programs on TV, language that wasn't very tolerant at times. They were reading stuff on the media that might be using rhetoric which was also not very tolerant, sometimes intentionally, at other times not. But they were never really exposed to the voices of the people who had been forcibly displaced, the people who had to leave their home. And hence, it was very difficult for them to actually empathize, because it was all very one-sided. And the kind of discourse that they were being exposed to was what it is. So by exposing them to something like this, I was hoping to actually make them think, not only about the experience described in such a text, but also about what they felt in relation to it, and why they felt that way. And perhaps by questioning the way they felt, the way they thought, they could develop those beliefs and those attitudes. And I chose to do this not by means of the printed poem only, but by trying to actually look for multimodal representations of such a text. Today I'm going to focus only on this example, but in my work as a teacher, I've used a number of similar examples, a number of similar multimodal products in order to try and make people think about who they were as individuals and what they felt towards something like migration. So I'm going to show you a clip that you can find on YouTube, a video put together where the poet herself recites the poem. And what we realize when we hear her recite the poem is that she is not immune to the emotions evoked by the words. She actually feels those words very powerfully, and they communicate something to her about the experience that she's focusing on. And it is that very kind of emotion that I wanted to try and convey to my students. So it's Walsan Xerri reciting the poem, but at the same time, it is also as a video, in terms of someone illustrating different images from the poem.
Home. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. And the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factories, holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. And even then, you carry the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in airport toilets, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you would not be going back. You have to understand, and no one would put their children in a boat unless the sea is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains, beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the gallbladder of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. No one crawls under fences, wants to be beaten, wants to be pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison because prison is safer than a city of fire, and one prison guard in the night is safer than 14 men who look like your father. No one could take it, could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. The go home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry. Niggers with their hands out, they smell strange, savage, messed up their own country, and now they want to mess up ours. How do the words, the dirty looks, roll off your back? And maybe it's because the blow is softer than a limb torn off, or the words are more tender than 14 men between your legs, or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child's body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of a gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs. Leave your clothes behind. Crawl through the desert. Wade through the oceans. Drown. Save. Be hungry. Beg. Forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home unless home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here.
Powerful, isn't it? Yeah. And powerful not only because of the emotion that is being expressed, but also because it makes us realize that we can do something about this as well. All of our students can do something. It is also our responsibility as human beings to do something. So what I'm trying to do here is to show that such multimodal resources can take us beyond merely language learning, can really make us step into the role of educators who are addressing those global skills that we've mentioned at this conference, enable us to actually try and develop the empathy of our learners and make them see that they can actually change the world as well. These multimodal resources are engaging, they enrich meaning-making, especially if the students themselves play the role not merely of consumers, but of producers, where their creativity is harnessed by enabling them to create such a video in the first place, put together the crafted integration of different media in order to interpret a text and in order to interpret a linguistic artifact. They also enable the students to activate their voice, not give them a voice, they already have a voice, but it is a means by which they can activate that voice and express it. So if we're using texts in the classroom and we then show them how those texts can become multimodal products and enable them to step into the role of people who create those multimodal products, that voice can be loud and clear. And since they're doing that, since we're not merely expecting them to listen or to watch, but we're expecting them to create, to produce, then this maximizes their own creativity. And finally, perhaps most importantly, it helps them to go against the discourse that they might be constantly inundated with in the society in which they live. Discourse which might be bigoted, racist, and which might be continuing to contribute to that crisis of solidarity I referred to earlier. As I've shown in this particular talk, the emphasis is not just on English language teaching, but English language teaching serving a more noble purpose. The purpose of actually enabling our learners to develop their empathy, to develop their own solidarity with others, and so many other important competences and skills. Now, if you allow me, I'm going to plug my forthcoming book, which focuses on something of the sort, using English for 21st century skills. It features chapters by people like Sarah Mercer, who talk about the use of positive psychology and other aspects. And it tries to actually show that we as language educators are primarily educators, not just people who are concerned with the language only. So thank you so much.